On February 5, 2024, the whole world was almost stunned when King Charles III appeared on every major newspaper with a short but shocking announcement. The king had cancer. Just that. No cancer type, no disease stage, no prognosis, not a single clear explanation for the public. Buckingham Palace threw out just one cold phrase, "Another matter of concern," and then the doors immediately slammed shut. But in the world of the British royal family, silence is sometimes even more terrifying than a confession. For more than 2 years, the public was led through a maze of perfectly staged photographs, forced waves on the balcony, pale smiles before the cameras, polished but empty press releases. The British media was fed information in drips, while behind the ancient stone walls of Buckingham, a silent panic was spreading like an underground fire beneath the wooden floors of the entire monarchy. And then, May 2026 changed everything. Those who had sworn absolute loyalty to the royal family finally broke their silence. Insider sources began to reveal a picture more brutal than any Netflix series had ever dared to write. This is not just a story about an aging king struggling for his life with the most expensive experimental RNA regimens in the world. This is a true crisis of power. The bruises on the body of the king, emergency meetings at midnight, the silent preparation for a transfer of the throne to Prince William, and on the other side of the palace walls, Prince Harry was almost eliminated from every chessboard of power. The question now is no longer whether the king is sick or not. The real question is what the British royal family has been hiding all this time. And before we tear down the velvet curtain covering this secret, let me know your perspective. If you think Buckingham Palace has the right to keep the illness of the king a secret to protect the stability of the throne, comment number 1. Or, if the public has the right to know the whole truth because they are the ones paying taxes to feed this entire monarchy, comment number 2. Because to understand why the palace is so afraid of the truth, we must turn back the wheel of history and discover a chilling reality. Concealment, information control, and lies have been flowing in the veins of the British royal family for generations. Everything began with a seemingly harmless announcement. In January 2024, Buckingham Palace confirmed King Charles III would be hospitalized to treat a benign, enlarged prostate. Pay attention to that phrase, benign. In medical language, this is almost an absolute signal of reassurance. It sends a very clear message to the public. Not cancer, not life-threatening, nothing to panic about. Major news agencies immediately repeated exactly that message. A routine corrective procedure. The king is still healthy, nothing to worry about. The whole media machine operated as smoothly as a Swiss watch. But then just a few days later, everything collapsed. On February 5, 2024, that same palace suddenly confirmed the king had cancer. Not having abnormal signs, not needing further monitoring, but actual cancer. And immediately, a massive question appeared about how someone who was just announced to have a benign, enlarged prostate could suddenly transition to cancer in such a short time. People wonder if these are two completely different issues, why the palace did not state it clearly from the beginning, and if doctors discovered signs of cancer during treatment, why the entire initial announcement was written with an almost absolute reassuring tone. That gap is exactly where suspicion began to multiply. And the most notable thing does not lie in the disease itself. It lies in how the British royal family manages the truth. Because for Buckingham, information has never been simply information. It is a tool of control. It is a shield of power. It is a part of a survival strategy. In the eyes of many Americans, this sounds more like an HBO political series than real life. But for the British royal family, this is practically a tradition. To understand that, we must go back in time more than 7 decades. In 1951, King George VI, the grandfather of King Charles, was diagnosed with severe lung cancer. His condition was so dangerous that doctors had to remove his entire left lung. But the British public at that time was only told about structural abnormalities. Just that. No cancer. not critical. No complete truth was announced. And the most chilling thing of all is that many historical documents later showed that the king himself was not told the full severity of his condition. Think about that for a few seconds. A king living inside the largest palace in England, but surrounded by a system that filtered the truth even from him. That was not a media incident. That was a behavioral model, a standard procedure. The British royal family always believes that the stability of the monarchy is more important than absolute transparency. They believe the public does not need to know the whole truth, only enough so they do not panic. And to be honest, for many decades, that strategy worked. In the era of Queen Elizabeth II, the palace almost completely controlled its public image. The British media had unwritten rules. Paparazzi understood the boundaries. The press understood when to stop. The system existed based on an unspoken exchange of benefits between royal power and the right to access information. But the world in 2026 is no longer the world in 1951. Today, every step of the royal family is tracked by high-resolution cameras. Every small gesture is analyzed frame by frame on TikTok, YouTube, Reddit, and X. A hand tremor lasting 2 seconds can instantly become a topic of global debate. And that is exactly when the wall of information control of Buckingham began to show cracks. The public began paying attention to small details that might have been ignored in the past. A paler face than usual, a slower walk, public appearances abruptly shortened, events cancelled at the last minute with vague reasons. Then the photos began to spread. Some pictures showed the hands of the king having unusually red and swollen signs. A few other photos caused internet users to argue about bruises appearing around his wrists and the back of his hands, signs that many people believe could be related to intensive medical treatment. Of course, no one outside the palace has the real medical records. And to be fair, age, lighting, camera angles, or common side effects can all create misleading images. But the problem is here. When trust has begun to fracture, all silence automatically turns into fuel for suspicion. And that is the biggest mistake of Buckingham. They thought they were still living in an era where a press release could end all questions. But the modern public no longer believes in velvet curtains. They want data. They want consistency. They want clear answers. Because the palace can use words to navigate the media, they can use rituals to create a stable image. They can use silence to delay a crisis. But they forgot a fundamental thing. The human body does not know how to lie, and the lenses of the paparazzi never blink. If Buckingham Palace controls words almost perfectly, there is one thing they can never absolutely control. That is the image. A press release can be rewritten 10 times before publication. An official statement can be weighed word by word, as if handling classified national documents. But the human body, especially the body of a man in his 70s battling an illness, operates by its own rules. And throughout the past 2 years, the body of King Charles III has begun to tell a completely different story from what Buckingham wants the public to believe. Everything started with his hands. At first glance, they were just normal photos. The king stepped out of a car, waved to the crowd, held an umbrella, shook hands with politicians. But then, the internet did what the internet always does, zooming in on every detail. Royal forums on Reddit, accounts specializing in image analysis on X, medical experts invited onto American television, all began revolving around the same question of what was happening to the hands of the king. In many photos, his fingers appeared unusually red and swollen. The skin tightened, almost shining slightly under the camera flash. Some other frames showed faint purple patches around his wrists and the back of his hands. Once, when the king stepped out of the familiar black Bentley, a camera caught a moment that lasted less than 2 seconds. A dark bruise located right next to the vein line on his left hand. Buckingham never explained. And that very silence made everything scrutinized even more closely. To be fair, this needs to be made clear. No one outside the royal medical team knows the exact medical records of the king. Older people can bruise more easily, due to skin thinning over time. Certain cardiovascular or anticoagulant medications can also create similar marks. But the problem lies in the frequency. Those signs appeared repeatedly for many consecutive months. And then, independent doctors began offering notable analyses on American media. Some suggested that the bruises could be related to frequent intravenous fluid administration. Others mentioned the possibility of intensive treatment, where needles are continuously inserted into the same area on the hand of the patient. No one affirmed for sure that it was chemotherapy, but no one could deny that those marks did not look like the image of someone who is just undergoing routine health monitoring. Then came the issue of weight. Look closely at the photos of the king from early 2024 and compare them with late 2025. The change is very clear. The face is more sunken. The neck is visibly thinner under the blazer collar. The shoulders look smaller, even though they are still held up by perfectly tailored suits from Savile Row. The strange thing is that this change is not stable. There are weeks when the king appears relatively healthy. His skin is rosier, his steps are steadier, but then just a few weeks later, he looks visibly tired, with sunken eyes, a pale face, and significantly slower movements. That is the kind of fluctuation that many experts describe as a treatment cycle, getting a bit better after resting, then losing strength after intensive medical interventions. And if it were only about appearance, Buckingham might still be able to control the narrative. But the schedule of the king is where the real questions explode. Because the British royal family is obsessed with protocol and public schedules. Every visit, every audience, every charity event is detailed weeks in advance. This is a system that operates like the military. Yet throughout 2025 and early 2026, strange gaps began to appear. State visits were cancelled at the last minute. Audiences were rescheduled due to health reasons. Some events lasted only 15 minutes before abruptly ending. There were weeks with almost no public activities other than a few strictly controlled photos inside the palace. And every time that happened, Buckingham used the same familiar formula. The king continues to work with a positive spirit. The doctors are satisfied with the treatment progress. There is nothing to worry about. But the more they are repeated, the more those statements begin to sound like slogans rather than the truth, especially when the public notices a very strange detail, as most of the appearances of the king are strictly limited, almost designed for him to appear just long enough for the cameras to record and then immediately disappear behind car doors or behind the stone walls of the palace. In the modern political world, image is health. If an American president appears weak before the cameras, the financial market will immediately react. If a prime minister continuously cancels schedules, it will spark rumors of an internal crisis. And for the British royal family, where all power exists based on the symbol of stability, the image of the king is even more important than anything else. That is why Buckingham tries to control every camera angle, every footstep, every moment of public appearance. But sometimes, the very effort to conceal becomes the greatest evidence that something serious is happening behind the velvet curtain. Because those bruises do not look like the marks of routine health checkups. They look like the consequences of a prolonged medical battle, a secret, extremely expensive treatment regimen, and possibly unprecedented for any sitting head of state in modern history. Up until the spring of 2026, most of the world still believed that Buckingham Palace was controlling the health situation of King Charles III. Yes, the king seemed weaker. Yes, the schedule was significantly reduced. But the public was still led by a vague hope that this was just a difficult treatment phase, and then everything would stabilize again. Then April 2026 happened. Royal journalist Tom Sykes suddenly released a report that shocked the British media. Not with a sensational tabloid-style statement, not with a clickbait shock title. The thing that made that article terrifying was its extremely calm tone. According to internal sources that Sykes accessed, the king was said to be participating in an advanced treatment regimen based on mRNA technology combined with personalized immunotherapy, an extremely expensive, extremely new treatment direction, and almost exclusively reserved for the ultra-wealthy or patients in special priority programs. And immediately, all of London almost exploded with speculation. Because the phrase mRNA after the COVID pandemic is no longer unfamiliar to the American public. But what most people do not know is that the technology is not only used for viral vaccines. For many years, pharmaceutical corporations and the largest cancer research institutes in the world have been silently racing to turn mRNA into a weapon against cancer. The idea sounds almost like science fiction. Instead of attacking the tumor with strong toxic chemicals, like traditional chemotherapy, mRNA therapy tries to teach the own immune system of the body to recognize and hunt down cancer cells as a target to be destroyed. To put it more simply, it turns the body into a self-defense battlefield. For some patients, especially at certain stages, this therapy can help significantly prolong survival time. Some cases even record tumors shrinking much more than expected. But this is the part Buckingham does not want the public to focus on. Most of these therapies are still in experimental or semi-experimental forms. They are not magic drugs. Not a Hollywood miracle where the patient walks out of the hospital healthy after an emotional background music scene. They are extremely complex, extremely costly technologies, and the results vary greatly between individual patients. Some American medical experts estimate that the most advanced personalized immune regimens can cost hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars per year if multiple parallel treatment methods are combined. And that is exactly where the story becomes extremely politically sensitive. Because the British public began to ask an uncomfortable question: whether the king is accessing a level of medicine that the vast majority of his subjects will never have the chance to touch. While the NHS system of Britain is continuously overloaded, while thousands of patients wait for months for a specialist appointment, the head of the monarchy gets access to the most advanced medical technologies on the planet, behind closed doors. That is an extremely dangerous contrast in terms of image, and Buckingham understands that. That is why they almost never specifically explain what method the king is being treated with. Instead, they began using a very special phrase in leaked internal memos: precautionary phase, roughly translated, a preventive treatment phase. It sounds very gentle, very controlled. It almost makes the listener think that the king is just taking maintenance medication for safety. But many medical experts immediately paid attention to the use of this wording. Because in clinical practice, such soft phrases are sometimes used to avoid telling a much harder truth. The disease does not disappear, it is only being managed. There is a huge difference between cured and controlled. Cured means the cancer disappears completely. Controlled means doctors try to keep it from progressing faster. And when the American media began to carefully analyze the statements from Buckingham, they noticed a highly remarkable detail. The palace almost never used the phrase cancer-free. Never. Not once did they publicly confirm that the king was completely free of cancer. Instead, there were vague phrases like the following: the treatment is progressing positively. The king is responding well. Continuing to manage health. It sounds positive, but completely avoids the concept of a full recovery. That is the kind of language crisis communication teams often use when they want to maintain hope for life, without making any commitment to the final outcome. And if the leaked information is accurate, it means that the king might be living in an extremely fragile medical state, not dying immediately, but also not truly out of danger. A state of existence relying on a dense treatment schedule, relying on medication, relying on artificial immunity, relying on high-tech injections specifically designed for his body. Try to imagine that pressure in the context of the British royal family. A king is not just a human being. He is the symbol of stability for the entire nation. Every time he appears in public is a signal sent to the financial markets, the political arena, and the Commonwealth. So what happens if that symbol exists thanks to a continuous chain of experimental treatments? What happens if the body simply responds poorly to one cycle of medication, the entire royal schedule could be overturned in a matter of days. That is the true nightmare of Buckingham. Not just the illness, but the unpredictability of the illness. Because cancer does not care about royal protocol. It does not care about audience schedules. It does not care about hundreds of years of tradition. And it certainly does not care whether the country needs a stable image or not. It only operates according to its own cold biology. And according to many internal sources, that is exactly what caused senior royal advisors to begin silently preparing for unprecedented scenarios. It is no longer the question of whether the king will fully recover, but rather how long the king can maintain his role, how long before the treatments leave him without enough strength to appear regularly, how long before the public begins to realize the gap between the official image and the medical reality behind the scenes. That is the moment the story is no longer simply a personal tragedy. It becomes a constitutional issue, because the fact that the king must live depending on weekly experimental injections is not just his own battle for survival. It is the smoldering tinder waiting to ignite the largest legal and succession crisis in Britain in the 21st century. There is a cold truth that Buckingham Palace understands better than anyone. A nation can accept an elderly and frail king. But a constitutional monarchy cannot accept a king who is still alive, but no longer capable of performing his supreme duties. And that is exactly the legal nightmare that has been silently enveloping Britain for the past several months. When the public heard the news that King Charles III was being treated for cancer, most people simply thought in a very human way. The king is sick, the king is resting, the king is receiving treatment. But behind the closed doors of Buckingham, the story is much more complex, because in the British monarchy system, the king is not just a ceremonial symbol. In constitutional theory, he is still the head of state. Every law is signed in his name. Every government operates under the crown. The Prime Minister still has to meet the king weekly to report on national affairs. That leads to an extremely sensitive question. What happens if the king is still alive, but medication, treatment, or health conditions leave him no longer capable of handling his role in a stable manner? That is exactly when the name of the Regency Act began to appear in closed-door discussions. The Regency Act, the British Regency legislation, is one of the most special constitutional mechanisms of the monarchy. It was designed for extreme situations, when the monarch is still alive but no longer capable of ruling due to physical or mental illness. It might sound far-fetched, but it is not at all. British royal history has witnessed this before. King George III once fell into a state of mental instability so severe that the Prince Regent had to run the country in his place. And since then, Britain has always maintained a legal mechanism ready for a similar situation. But this is the most terrifying part. The Regency Act does not automatically trigger because a person has cancer. It only appears when there is doubt that the king is no longer capable of performing his duties. Understand that. It is not about dying, but about losing the ability to operate power. And that is exactly the gray area that causes Buckingham to panic, because modern cancer therapies, especially strong immune regimens or experimental treatments, sometimes come with extremely unpredictable side effects. Prolonged fatigue, cognitive fog, nervous exhaustion, loss of focus, periods where the body is almost completely drained of energy after treatment. A businessman can take a few weeks off. A chief executive officer can temporarily delegate authority. But what about a king? The British royal family exists based on an almost sacred principle: the absolute continuity of the crown. No gaps, no chaos. The public must not be allowed to feel that the throne is shaking. And because of that, every time Prince William appears in place of his father in high-level duties, royal observers see more than a normal support schedule. They see a silent transfer of power. Look at the speed of change. In a very short time, William began appearing in roles that were previously almost exclusively reserved for the monarch: state meetings, speeches with national symbolic nature, key diplomatic audiences, duties directly related to the stability of the Commonwealth. At first glance, Buckingham calls it a reasonable division of responsibilities. But many royal analysts do not believe in that coincidence, because there is a huge difference between supporting the king and operating in place of the king. William is not just helping his father, he is being pushed into the role of a de facto king, much faster than the natural timeline the royal family had anticipated. And remember this, Queen Elizabeth II reigned for 7 decades. William grew up with the mindset that he still had a lot of time before having to bear the crown. But the cancer of Charles has destroyed that entire traditional transition rhythm. Suddenly, William is no longer being gradually prepared. He is thrown straight into the center of the storm, one day being the crown prince, the next day almost having to act like an uncrowned king. And that pressure is clearly visible on his face in recent months. Old photos of William once showed the image of a fairly relaxed air, calm, controlling the media well, sometimes even carrying a British aristocratic relaxed vibe. But since the health crisis of Charles and the treatment issues of Catherine, Princess of Wales, the face of William began to change significantly. Older, more tense, more tired. It is not just family pressure. It is the weight of an entire institution bearing down on the shoulders of a man who is not yet completely ready. And the most ironic thing, the more Buckingham tries to deny the possibility of a succession crisis, the more they unintentionally prove that the transition is being prepared at an urgent pace. Because if everything is truly stable, why does William have to take over so many important roles? Why does the royal media team continuously build his image as the new center of stability of the monarchy? Why are senior advisors said to be carefully reviewing procedures related to the Regency Act behind the scenes? No one wants to say that publicly, because the very moment Britain begins seriously discussing a king who is still alive but no longer capable of ruling, the entire psychology of stability of the monarchy will immediately be shaken. The market will react. The Commonwealth will react. British politics will react. And most importantly, the public will start looking at Charles no longer as a king undergoing medical treatment, but as a monarch gradually entering the final transition phase of power. That is why Buckingham tries to keep everything in the gray zone. Not completely healthy. Not completely critical. No official transition. But also not entirely the same as before. A dangerously suspended state. And while William is being forced to learn how to put on the cloak of a future king faster than anyone predicted, on the other side of the Atlantic, there is another son of Charles, who is increasingly being pushed away from the center of royal power. One door is gradually opening for William, and at the same time, another door is also silently closing for Prince Harry. In every royal crisis, there is always a moment when the story no longer revolves around politics, protocol, or power. It becomes a family matter, an elderly father facing illness, 2 sons who no longer look each other in the eye, and a woman once hated by all of Britain, now becoming the last person standing in front of the storm swallowing the monarchy. That moment began in February 2024. Right after King Charles III announced his cancer diagnosis, Prince Harry immediately boarded a plane from California to London. The global media instantly fueled hopes of a historic reconciliation. A son putting aside conflicts to return to his father in the most difficult time. It sounds like a perfect Hollywood movie, but the reality is much colder. According to widely circulated reports at the time, the meeting between Harry and his father lasted only about 45 minutes. 45 minutes. Think about that. A son flying over 5,000 miles across the Atlantic after hearing his father had cancer, only to have less than an hour with him before the king left by helicopter. No family dinner, no overnight stay at the Royal Center, no emotional reunion photos, just a meeting so short that many American royal experts called it a controlled contact. And right from there, suspicions began to flare up. Was Harry truly informed of the full medical condition of his father? Or was he only allowed to see the part of the truth that Buckingham wanted him to see? That is an extremely sensitive question. But remember, from the perspective of the palace, Harry is no longer simply a disgruntled royal member. He is a high-level media risk. After the American television interviews, after Netflix, after a series of public accusations aimed at the royal family, the trust between Harry and the Buckingham machine has almost completely collapsed. In the eyes of many royal advisors, any internal information shared with Harry carries the risk of eventually appearing on American media. Sounds cruel, perhaps, but put yourself in the position of those trying to protect the monarchical image amid an unprecedented health crisis. They do not look at Harry as the suffering youngest son. They look at him as an uncontrollable variable. And that is where the tragedy truly begins. Because according to many royal sources analyzed by the British press over the past 2 years, King Charles III seems to still hold a soft spot for Harry, despite being hurt, despite being angry, despite being disappointed. He is still a father facing the finite nature of time. Illness does that to people. It makes power struggles suddenly become much smaller. It makes people start thinking about reconciliation. But the problem is that Charles is no longer the absolute center of power. In the shadows behind the throne, a new gravitational pull is forming around Prince William. And according to many royal observers, William looks at the issue completely differently from his father. To Charles, Harry is still a son. To William, Harry has become a threat to the future of the institution. That is the core difference. Charles thinks with family emotions. William thinks like a future king. After everything that has happened, from the interviews with Oprah Winfrey to the memoir Spare, many believe that William is almost incapable of forgiveness on both a personal and institutional level. In his eyes, Harry did not just hurt the family. Harry weakened the very royal brand in an era where the monarchy is fighting to maintain its legitimacy before the younger generation. And that is why all reconciliation efforts seem to continuously hit an invisible wall. On one side is a father weakening from illness, wanting to at least close his final years with less regret. On the other side is the heir to the throne, believing that reopening the door for Harry means bringing risk back into the center of the system. A war no one dares to speak of directly before the cameras. But everyone can feel it. And amidst all that chaos, there is a figure whom history will perhaps look back on in a completely different way. Queen Camilla. Perhaps no one in the modern royal family has ever been hated as fiercely as Camilla. In the eyes of millions of Britons for decades, she was a symbol of betrayal, the third woman in the marriage with Diana, Princess of Wales. Her name was once dragged across the newspapers, once publicly booed, once considered the woman who could never be accepted. But history sometimes has a very cruel sense of humor, because now, the very woman who was once the most hated in Britain is becoming the final shield protecting the image of the fracturing monarchy. Throughout the time Charles received treatment, Camilla was almost not allowed to collapse in public. She continued to appear at events, continued to smile before the cameras, continued to maintain the rhythm of royal activities, while most of public opinion focused on the health of the king and the rise of William. And the remarkable thing is that those who once criticized Camilla the most harshly are now beginning to admit an uncomfortable truth. She truly stayed, did not run away from the pressure, did not disappear when the crisis happened, did not let the system collapse because of personal emotions. Many body language experts even point out that in her recent appearances, Camilla frequently carries the demeanor of someone exhausted, but forced to keep the entire room stable. A woman simultaneously caring for a severely ill husband and forcing herself to maintain a calm image for the entire monarchy. That is not a fairy tale. That is literal soul-crushing pressure. And when looking at the whole picture, the history of concealing illness, secret treatment regimens, constitutional worries, preparations for the transfer of power, an unhealable brotherhood feud, along with a queen trying to keep everything from collapsing, we begin to realize a truth much larger than just an illness. Every puzzle piece is connecting together, and all of them are leading to a single conclusion. A panoramic picture that Buckingham Palace will probably do everything in its power so that the public will never see it in its entirety. Since that fateful day in February 2024, King Charles III and Buckingham Palace have entered one of the largest image control campaigns in modern royal history. They show the world the image of a resilient king, still smiling, still waving to the crowd, still appearing in perfectly tailored suits under the camera flashes. But behind that red velvet and those ancient rituals is a silent battle for survival that the public is almost never allowed to see in its entirety. A king having to rely on the most advanced medical therapies to maintain the stability of the throne. A royal machine silently preparing for constitutional scenarios it never wanted to activate. A family stretched thin between duty, power, illness, and cracks that have never truly healed. The most tragic thing is this. King Charles III waited over 7 decades to place on his head the crown he pursued all his life. But in the end, the greatest enemy of that reign is not the media, not royal scandals, not family rebellions, but rather the cells that are silently betraying his own body every day. And at that moment, all royal power suddenly becomes very small, because even as the King of the United Kingdom, he ultimately still has to stand in the same hospital corridor of fate, where millions of cancer patients around the world are fighting every day to prolong their time with their families. Buckingham Palace can try to keep this story behind closed doors. But history has proven one thing. The truth always finds a way out into the light. So, what about you? Do you think the silence of the British royal family is necessary to protect the stability of the monarchy, or is it a concealment that deprives the public of their right to know the truth? Leave your perspective in the comments section. And do not forget to vote number 1 or number 2, as we agreed at the beginning of the video. If you want to continue exploring the hidden corners of power, the battles for the throne, and the secrets never spoken directly to the public from the British royal family, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss the next videos. Goodbye. And see you again in the next story about the world behind the walls of Buckingham.